Hello everyone, I warmly welcome you to this channel. In this video, I am going to tell you about an officer in the army who died and went to hell. What he saw was very horrible and terrified. Likes and comments are super easy thing that you can do to help push this video to a wider audience. Please, take a second down below and let us know how we are doing. And if you have not subscribed, please, kindly do so right away. It really does help us continue to make content that helps you. Thank you. This is an audio revelation that was sent to us through the mail by a former army officer from Australia. I am going to play the audio so that you can hear from the horse's own mouth. I humbly urge you to watch and listen to this to an end.
Hello, sir. My name is Oliver William. I'm from Australia. I am a former army officer in the Australia. Back in 1979, right after I had given my heart to Jesus Christ, I was just in and out in a holy pursuit of God. With every fiber of my being. With every part of my existence. Just as a young man, I was seeking God. I had nothing else to seek. I had nothing else to live for. So I was going after God. And in the midst of that time, I saw people getting saved. Healed. Delivered. Casting out devils. I just saw God did so many wonderful things. And I would get together usually almost every night with some of the guys that the Lord allowed me to win to the Lord, and we would have a Bible study or we would pray. One night, I came back to my barracks and a good friend of mine, American brother by the name, John Robert. We got together to pray. Well, right outside of our barracks was what we called the common area, where there was a bunch of guys in our battalion that had gotten together to have a party. So they were out there and they got their music playing. They were drinking their alcohol or cooking hamburgers, and they were just having a good old time. But, me and Robert went into our dormitory room. And we just began to pray, crying out to God, interceding for souls, praying for the guys out there in the common area. And all of a sudden, what the Bible calls, the burden of the Lord came upon me so real. So strong, and my heart was breaking for all of these men that didn't know God. And I began to weep. And I began to pray a very strange prayer. And so, all of a sudden, out of my mouth, I began to ask God to allow me to go to hell. I know that sounds really strange. But I said, Lord, let me experience the realities of hell, that I can have compassion on those who are going there. I was praying this strange prayer, when all of a sudden, the whole room that I was in, was filled with gross darkness. I'm telling you, to me, it was physical, it was literal. It was what I was seeing out of my physical eyes. It went black, the whole room, it was a thick blackness, everything disappeared, it was totally black. Then, in this blackness, everything was gone. I could not hear the guys out there having their party. I couldn't hear the music, everything went totally dead. Still, I could not hear anything. And there was this tremendous blackness. And I didn't even see John Robert. Although he was in the same room with me. All of a sudden, in this blackness, an earthquake hit that room. At that moment, I didn't realize it was a spiritual experience, because I was located in Rottnest. I can't give you all the fine details of what I went through, because this thing went on, for about 2.5 hours. I'm going to briefly share with you what happened. All of a sudden, the room began to shake. I was on the island called Rottnest, and we always had earthquakes out there. We were out there in the Timor Sea. It was an anti-submarine missile nuclear base. They never really told us what they did there. But we knew it was a top secret. The room began to shake. As this was happening, the lights went out. But John Robert was no longer there. I was in that room alone. The room began to shake violently. Very violently. And that earthquake was growing very intensity, and all of a sudden stuffs were falling off the walls. The bed began to bounce. I hardly being able to stand up. It got so violent, I was on the floor, and being tossed to and fro. And all of a sudden, there was this terrible screeching sound. As I related to you, it was hard for me too, because it was so real. Even though it's 43 years ago, it was like yesterday. The floor of that room began to literally be ripped open. The floor began to rip open. It became like a drain. We were in a bathtub and things were falling. It tore open, and all of a sudden stuffs were falling down. It was like the whole room was beginning to be dumped into a big hole. I remember, to this day. My heart was filled with tremendous spirit. It was not a demonic fear. Just that, my heart was filled with fear, because I was heading for this hole on the floor. I was grabbing my bed, I was falling, and I finally got to the edge of this bed and the edge of that hole, that was on my way. I was looking down and I saw like a reddish-orange glow. I saw light down below me and I was falling towards that light. As I was falling towards that light, the next thing that hit me was this intense heat. The heat was coming up from the bottom of the hole. And it was just intense, and it literally felt like the flesh on my hands was going to begin to melt off. My face began to melt. The heat was so overwhelming. How in the world could I maintain consciousness in this situation? It had to be God. It was all supernatural at that time. I did not know it was supernatural. I could hardly breathe. Because the air was filled with a sulfuric smell, just so terrible, I cannot tell you. I tried to breathe. I remembered taking my shirt and putting it over my face, and I was trying to breathe because I couldn't. Because the smell was so terrible. So horrendous. The gases were so bad. As I was falling down that hole, it seemed like it was a never-ending hole. As I said earlier. To me, it was physical, literal. I was trying to stop myself from descending. Still, I kept falling down the black hole. It seemed I was falling forever. It was a nightmare. All of a sudden, I began to breathe in this terrible air. It smelled like sulfur. The bad smell was coming from the black hole. In the end, I could look up and could see the light where I fell, way above me. But down below me, there was nothing but blackness at this moment. I fell backward like you would off of a ladder. As I was falling into that hole, I was going past wires and cables. Because to me, it was not a spiritual experience. It was physical. It was real. I guess the hole would be about 3 feet wide in the circular sense. It just went straight down, as I was falling down this hole, and all of a sudden, I left the construction of the building and the wires and the cables. As I was falling down into that black hole, I remembered I was spinning, and hitting the walls of the hole. And my fingers were grabbing the sides of the wall, trying to stop my descent down the black hole. I was ripping my fingers up. I started screaming out so loudly. But I was experiencing this sulfuric smell. I could not breathe. I was experiencing this intense heat, that I could hardly stand it. And yet I was falling towards this orange glow at the bottom of that pit, and I was falling, and falling, and falling, and the heat was getting more intense. The smell was worst. I was thinking and asking myself, what was going on? What's happening? I didn't know where I was. There was no way I could stop myself from descending. And as I was falling towards the bottom of that hole, the light was getting brighter and brighter. It was a very bright light. It was flashing as well. It was a deep red, orange and gold colors. And next thing you know, I fell into that hole. When I fell into the hole, the most unmatchable thing you could imagine. I saw I was in this humongous cavern that was never ending. I could not see the end of it everywhere I looked. It was just a humongous cavern. And right below me was the largest lake of burning fire and lava I had ever seen. A humongous lake, burning lava. Just everywhere I looked, and it wasn't just a lake of lava that was lying there calm, but it was violent like tornadoes, because there were miniature hurricanes or tornadoes whipping across the whole area, whichever direction I was looking down. In the natural, it seemed like I was like 5,000 feet above this never-ending lake of lava. I was looking, and there were, whirlwinds of tornadoes of intense heat, and flame swirling across this lake. And there were explosions happening everywhere, just fountains of this lava exploding 1,000s of feet in the air, and there were exploding everywhere. And I was really losing it because here, I could hardly breathe the heat. Now the heat was even more intense than before. And I saw this huge never-ending lake of fire. I cannot describe to you the horror that filled my heart. The fear that filled my heart, and I couldn't breathe. The heat was overwhelming beyond what you can imagine. And I was watching these explosions of lava shooting up into the air and coming back down. The whole thing was like a violent ocean. All of the lava liquefied lava stones, and the lava burned different colors. It was bright orange, dark orange, some areas were dark, and this thing was completely just violent. The whole thing was this erupting. The underneath was about 5,000 feet, and that was the time I did realize it was hell. I didn't know it was. I couldn't imagine what happened to me because I was in my barracks. Next thing, the floor ripped open. And I fell through this hole. And I found myself in this cavern. I did not have any fear of going to hell. Because I knew my heart was right with God. I didn't know how hell was like, but I fell towards this huge lake of burning, churning, bubbling, boiling, and raging lava. As I was falling, the heat got so intense that all of a sudden, my clothes ignited in the fire. My shoes were burning on my feet. My hair exploded in the flames. I don't know how I can explain to you the pain and the agony that I went through. It was overwhelming. My whole body was like a torch. My skin ignited in the flames. My fingers were burning. My whole body was burning. In fact, I was burning in the fire. I was completely engulfed in flames. As I fell into that place called hell, I heard this eerie sound. It was a very weird sound. It was highs and lows sound. And it was just like somebody was stabbing me in the chest with a knife. Because it was so intense and was so painful. I didn't know what it was. And was getting louder and louder and louder. All of a sudden, the Spirit of God quickened in my mind. That loud sound was the screams and the cries of humanity. They were men and women screaming and wailing and crying in the lava of hell. I mean, they were screaming. They were screaming highs and lows sound. And it just began to rip my heart out. Again, all of a sudden, something hit me like a ton of bricks. As I was in the hell of burning, turning and bubbling lake of fire, I looked. And I began to see something on the surface of this boiling, bubbling lava. And they were like real little objects. And it seemed like they had some strange, 4 little limbs that were sticking out of these blackened objects. God had to give me eyes to see. Then God gave me curiosity in the midst of all my pain and my sufferings. I've gotten this curiosity. What was that? What were those items floating on the surface, and they would go down, and come back up, and be tossed around. Their limbs were just frantically moving every which direction. And as I was looking and getting closer, there were scattered millions of them across the surface. And they would come to the top and go and come to the top. And they were just everywhere. And all of a sudden, the reality hit my heart. They were human beings. They were people. They were burned and charred. They didn't look like humans anymore. You could not tell what was a man and what was a woman. You could not tell what colors they had been. You couldn't tell if they had been Caucasian, or blacks or reds or whatever nation they were. They were charred like a chicken over on a roaster and overcooked to where it's nothing but charred and black. I saw that they were everywhere. And they were screaming. They were all human beings. And they were just being tossed to and fro. While as I was looking at this, my mind was filled with horror. All of a sudden, I was plunged into this lake of lava. The minute I plunged into this lake of lava, that I was just swallowed up. I was swallowed up in this intense burning and churning. As I was swallowed up in the lake of lava, all of a sudden I was under it and I couldn't breathe. I was trying to suck air in. But there was no air. And yet I was not dying. I was burning with instantaneous heat. But I was not dying. Oh, my eyes felt like they were being burned out on my socket, but I didn't stop seeing. So here I was. I was swallowed up in this absolute misery, complete misery. And I went down to the depths of this lava. And I could feel the pulling me and turning me and twisting me, like these other people that were being tossed to and fro. Millions and millions of people. Billions of people. And the next thing was, I would come to the surface. And would toss me up and then suck me back down. And so, this pain seemed to be never ending, and that experience was over 2 hours long. So I was being tossed to and fro. And in the midst of all of these pains, all of these agonies, there was this overwhelming desire for water. I was so thirsty. It was a mind-boggling thirst. I was so thirsty. I cannot explain it, but there's no water to have forever. Now listen, the rich man being in hell is crying out to Abraham and saying, just give me a drop of water. In hell, there is no water. And it's just, I think it's symbolic, like in this earth. There is so much water, that it's incredible. But in hell, there is no water. I think it's like the mercy of God in hell. There is no mercy, and how there is no forgiveness, and how you'll never get another chance to repent. And in hell, you never get another opportunity to live for God. And so here I was being tossed to and fro in the blackness, and I said a blackness, because I believe God allowed me to see what was going on. But actually, there is no light in hell. It's completely black, completely dark, you're completely swallowed up into this lake of lava, where there's never-ending pain, never-ending sorrow, never going to get another drink of water. And as I was in the midst of these, all of a sudden, I realized there was another thing that was completely absent. Totally absent, and it was the greatest horror you could ever experience. And it was this. There was no love in hell. No love. None of the goodness of God. Nothing, just absolutely void of love. Look, people don't realize, when you live in this world, you see the love of God everywhere, whether you appreciate it or not. You see it in the flowers. You see it in the birds, you see it in the blue skies above, you see it in the snow-capped mountains, you see it in the crashing waves upon the shore of the ocean. You experience the love of God, you smell the love of God, you're walking in the love of God without even knowing it. You're walking in the reality of God without even knowing it. Sinners living in this world, and everywhere they look, they have no excuse, because the reality of Christ is everywhere. But in hell, there is no love. You'll never have another drink of water. There's nothing but never-ending pain and never-ending sorrow. Another thing that hit me at that time was what the Bible calls that in hell, there is what we call the worm that never dies. And the worm that never dies is the reality that you will be remembering. I could have been saved. I could have loved God. I could have obeyed the Lord. I could have walked with Jesus. But I turned it down. I'll never have another chance to get saved. I'll never have another chance to get right. I'll never have another chance to do God's will. So I was in this, and I was making it very quickly here because of the thoughts that came into my head, the pain, the sorrow, the loneliness. And that's another thing in hell, you're all alone. There is no communication between the damned. They can't help because they're so full of pain. They're so full of agony. They're so full of sorrow. The worm that never dies is eating up their conscience. They're crying, they're screaming, they're wailing, they're wanting help, but they can't get help. And it's so dark that you're bumping into other people. You're smashing into other human beings. But there is no communication. There is no helping each other. You are completely doomed and damned and lost forever. So I was in this lake of fire. I was in this place called hell for hours. I was tortured. I was tormented. I couldn't get a drink. I experienced none of the love of God. I was completely lonely. I was cut off from everybody. I was bumping into other human beings, but there was no communication. I was under the wrath of God. I was under the anger and under the judgment of God. There is just an overwhelming fear of God, knowing you could have been saved, knowing you could have walked with God. Then all of a sudden, you would hear their voices shut off as they would go onto the surface. Again, this was all around me. I was surrounded by people screaming, and that was what I heard when I was falling like a skydiver towards the lake of fire. That was what I heard, people screaming with highs and lows sound, and pleadings and cursings against God. I discovered I was not cursing God, because my heart was right with God. In the midst of hell, I was praising Him. Every time I would come to the surface, I screamed the word, that God has loved me. Jesus, Father, you're wonderful. I was in the pit of hell, and I was worshiping God in hell. I was praising God in hell, I was magnifying God, and none of these other souls were praising God. None of these other souls were worshiping God. None of these other souls were exalting Christ when I was exalting Christ in hell, and being tossed to and fro by the flames and the waves of the liquefied lava. I was worshiping, and I was praising, and I was exalting God. And I was crying out, "Oh, God, deliver me from this place. Oh, God, rescue me from this place now." And in one moment, I was being tossed to the surface of this waves of this liquefied lava, when all of a sudden I heard this most magnificent voice that you could ever imagine. It was so strong, it was so real. It was so amazing. And I heard and I knew it was the voice of God. And I heard Him say this and all of hell shook. He said, "Let my servant go." Now, that minute I knew, it was the Father speaking. He said, "Let my servant go." The minute the voice of God came booming and thundering into the caverns of hell, it was like hell itself vomited me right out of it. I mean, it was like a volcano going off. It just exploded. In the end, the lava got underneath me and picked me up, and threw me out of the chambers of hell. Brethren, there's more to tell than this, but to make a long story short, I found myself back in my barracks, and I was on my knees, and I was weeping. I was crying, I was wailing. When I came out of this experience, I looked over, and Robert was there. And finally, when I was able to talk, as I communicate with Robert, he said, "William, what happened? What happened?" I said, "Robert, I went to hell." Now I could hear there was no music out there. It was completely quiet out in the commons. Before I had this experience, they had loud music on. They were laughing and joking and carrying on, but now it's completely quiet. Robert said to me, he was all shook up, and he said, "William, what happened?" He said, "For over 2 hours, you were screaming and yelling and crying like a madman." He said, "I didn't know what to do. All I could do was to pray." He said, "You were just screaming and yelling and crying all that time. What happened?" I said, Robert, I went to hell." He said, "You what?" I said, "Robert, I went to hell." I asked, "Where are the guys? I don't hear their music anymore." He said, "They heard your wailing, William."
Oh my goodness. That was a terrible experience in the pit of hell by Oliver William. Brethren, you heard it all from the horse's own mouth. Please, I will urge you to repent if you are still living in sin. For hell is real. Thank you, and God richly bless you for watching this video to the end. We appreciate your precious time spent on this video and all our videos. See you in our next video.